Right, and it's clear, because in the back of the book you have a series of questions that you ask the reader to really consider, and to let you know, to contact you. And so there is the instructor, the teacher, the healer part of you definitely comes through in the book and asks people to reflect. So even if you aren't ready to be a spoken word artist, you're inviting people to really let this help them sort through some of the experiences they may be having day to day and not know how to deal with that.
Right.
That's fabulous. We're going to move on to the second piece, which is about our purpose. And how did you discover your purpose? How did you discover this is how you want to express?
I think my mother probably saw my purpose before I did. The type of child I was very outgoing, and I loved to speak and I loved to perform. And she said, well, you need to find something to do in your life where you can use your mouth, because you need to find an occupation where you can actually speak to people. So she probably saw the potential before I did. I'm not really sure when it hit me. I used to frequent different poetry clubs, and I never really took poetry seriously until I just happened to start going to poetry clubs as a social event. It's just something that you do socially. You go out and hang out, you watch women and you hear good poetry and, get a drink or two. But as I started to go more and more, I started to see that there were individuals who had the same fears, the same passion, the same frustrations that I had, same stories, and they just chose to deliver them. And I said to myself, I can do that. And it wasn't that I said I can do it. It was more so like I must do it, because I felt that there were some stories within me that people had to hear. So people ask me all the time, well, what made you think of this? What made you think of that? It's hard to pinpoint what made me think of a particular poem. Sometimes I will write, many poets write from the poem and then develop the title. I write title down. So when something hits me, I develop a title for it right there. And then I write from that title. So the title is sort of like my grid. And it develops and it helps me stay without going off on tangents. So I write from title down as opposed to writing from poem up.
All right. I kind of get that. I call it headlines. When I'm writing like my books, sometimes it's similar. I'll get what I call a little headline. It'll be a very simple, singular, may not even be a complete sentence, but then the rest of it kind of unfolds. So what I'd like to do right now, actually, is let everybody have a little taste. Will you give us one of your poems?
Sure.
And then we'll come back and we'll finish asking you some questions. But I want people to get a taste of who you are, and I feel like I've cheated because I've read the book and love the work, but I think everybody needs to get a sense of what it is we're talking about here. Okay. So would you be so kind?
Sure.
All right.
I probably won't need the mic. The first piece I'll do is a piece called It Just Ain't. And the reason I use the word ain't is to deliver the message that it's not. Sometimes sometimes poets use certain words to drive a point home. So I've done this piece at numerous colleges and universities and high schools, and I give them the disclaimer. Yes, this word is ain't, but once you hear the poem, you'll see why it is that I use it. But the reason that I wrote the poem was to demonstrate how everything that we see isn't as it is. Sometimes, a lot of times, especially with our young people, they're fed someone's fantasy, and they are convinced that it's their reality. Even when we watch talk shows or we watch different shows or we read different books and we hear music, sometimes we look at someone's fantasy that they've written down, because a lot of artists that perform and write songs and do TVs and shows, things like that, a lot of those things are just fantasy. But when we see it and we like it and we attach ourselves to it, we sometimes define that as our reality.
It's real.
As real, So one of the reasons that I wrote the poem was to show and to demonstrate how sometimes when you see something, it may not be exactly as it is. Someone who may actually be appearing as your friend may actually not be. Someone who may exactly someone who you may feel is against you may not necessarily be. They may have your best interest at heart. You know, the whole theory behind the mean teacher wind up being the person who cared, the best teacher you've ever had.
Right.
So that was a driving force behind that.
Oh, please. We're anxious to hear it.
Okay.
It ain't so.
It just ain't.
It just ain't. Yeah.
No, you like the section?
Okay, all right.
It goes like this. It just ain't. It just ain't, man. It just ain't. You see, every brother man ain't brown, and everyone who's sad ain't wearing a frown, and everyone who claiming they hip ain't down. You see, every shut eye ain't sleeping, every grave ain't 6 feet deep, and every man you see moving in the middle of the night ain't trying to creep. It just ain't. You see, everything sold ain't for sale, and everyone blind ain't reading in Braille, and everyone you see behind bars is not necessarily in jail. Every doctor ain't healing the sick, and every magician ain't showing you his trick, and every presidential candidate ain't necessarily picked. It just ain't. You see, every classroom ain't teaching, and every minister ain't preaching, and every extended arm ain't exactly reaching. Everyone coming ain't staying. Everyone dressed for the game ain't playing, and just because you see somebody on their knees, that don't mean that they praying. It just ain't. You see, everyone wounded ain't bleeding, and everybody asking for your help ain't needing, and just because you see someone with a book in his hand, don't necessarily mean that he's reading. It just ain't. You see, everyone working ain't grinding, and everyone who's blinged out ain't shining, and some of us who be looking for love may not necessarily be finding. It just ain't. Everyone claiming victory ain't winning. Everyone asking for forgiveness ain't sinning. And your enemy could be ready to attack and still in your face grinning. It just ain't. You see, every tired soul ain't weary, and every sad eye ain't teary, and just because you understand the formula doesn't mean you've mastered the theory. It just ain't. Everyone singing lyrics don't know the song. And just because you feel bad don't necessarily mean you did wrong, and just because you fit in don't mean that that's where you belong. It just ain't. You see, everyone rhyming ain't flowing, and just because you're getting a little bigger don't necessarily mean you're growing. And everyone who's shouting about heaven ain't exactly going. It just ain't. You see, everyone flirting with you ain't winking. And everyone who appears to be drunk hasn't necessarily been drinking. And simply because you used your head doesn't mean you were thinking. That's why every joke you tell ain't funny. And every bright day ain't necessarily sunny. And every robbery and theft, y'all, ain't about the money. Every family ain't related. Every church ain't congregated. And every hoodlum and thug is not necessarily gang related. That's why every crime ain't investigated. It just ain't. Every cloud ain't bringing rain, and everyone shouting ouch ain't necessarily in pain, and everyone found guilty ain't necessarily the one to blame. Every king and queen ain't ruling from their throne, and every house you make ain't necessarily a home, and just because you ain't seen it don't mean it ain't been shown. It just